Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day my voice changed. Have you ever wondered what would happen if the one thing you were afraid to use became the thing that changed your life? For years, I thought my English was too weak, my opinions were too small, and my voice was better kept quiet. Then, one ordinary day in America, I walked into a voting place with my family, and something happened that I never expected. It was not really about politics. It was about me. And before that day ended, I finally understood why my voice mattered. I remember standing outside that building, holding my phone in one hand and my coffee in the other. I had practiced simple English sentences that morning. I am here. I have a question. Can you help me? 3 tiny sentences. Yet my heart treated them like a speech at the United Nations. I had spent so many days listening to English without speaking it. I could understand a story when people spoke slowly, but when someone talked quickly, my brain suddenly became a sleepy librarian who had lost the key to the dictionary. So I started changing one small habit. Instead of trying to learn difficult words, I practiced short sentences from my own life. I said them while cooking dinner. I repeated them while driving. I read them slowly before bed. My husband is making coffee. My daughter needs her shoes. I have an opinion. The sentences were simple, but they were mine. Repetition made speaking feel less dangerous. That makes sense psychologically. Practicing a skill repeatedly in manageable steps can help build familiarity and confidence. I was not becoming perfect. I was becoming less afraid. At home, my husband noticed the change before I did. One evening, he looked at me and said, "You seem different." I laughed and answered, "Maybe I finally learned how to complain in English." He laughed too. But underneath the joke, something serious was happening. I was learning that a voice is not created by perfect grammar. A voice is created when you decide your thoughts deserve to be heard. The voting experience made that lesson impossible to ignore. In the United States, voting is a way eligible citizens participate in federal, state, and local elections, with rules that vary by state. For me, the lesson was personal. I had spent years waiting until my English was perfect before allowing myself to speak. That day, I stopped waiting. I thought the hardest part would be walking through the door. I was wrong. The hardest part came after I walked out, when my daughter looked at me and asked one unexpected question that made me realize this story was much bigger than voting. A quiet life in America. What if the biggest change in your life happened at your own kitchen table, not at a voting place? The question my daughter asked me that evening was simple. "Mom, if you can speak for everyone else, why don't you speak for yourself?" I smiled because I wanted to joke. Instead, I felt something inside me crack open. I had spent years being the quiet woman who listened, nodded, cooked, helped, and moved on. But that night, my daughter was looking directly at me, waiting for an honest answer. Our home in America was ordinary in the best possible way. My husband liked strong coffee. My children left socks in places that socks had no business being. I kept telling them, "Please put your shoes away," while wondering why shoes seemed to multiply around our house. We laughed, argued about dinner, watched the news, and talked about school, work, money, weather, and weekend plans. This was my life. Yet inside that comfortable life, I carried a strange little fear. Speaking English in front of other people still made me nervous. I could understand simple conversations when people spoke clearly. But when someone spoke quickly, my brain sometimes went on vacation without telling me. I would smile and say, yes, even when I was thinking, I have absolutely no idea what you just said. Maybe you know that feeling. It is one reason English learners often practice silently but avoid speaking aloud. It feels safer when nobody can hear the mistake. But silence can become a habit. I learned that the hard way. So I created a tiny rule for myself every day. I would say 3 English sentences about my real life. Not complicated sentences. Useful ones. I need to buy groceries. My daughter is tired. I disagree, but I understand. That last sentence became my favorite because it sounded useful. It taught me something important about communication. Speaking is not only about vocabulary. It is about expressing a thought clearly enough for another person to understand you. That evening, my daughter repeated her question. Mom, why don't you speak for yourself? I looked at my husband. He was unusually quiet. Then he said something I did not expect. She is right. I laughed nervously. Great. 2 against 1. But nobody laughed. My husband reached across the table and said, you always tell us to use our voice. Maybe it's time you use yours. His words stayed with me. And the next morning, I opened my phone, searched for one simple English phrase, and discovered a sentence that would change how I understood my own voice. When English felt too hard. The next morning, I learned a sentence that looked almost too simple to matter. I have a voice. I stared at those 4 words on my phone and laughed. Why did such an easy sentence feel so difficult to say? Because I suddenly realized my real problem was never only English. I was afraid of being wrong, being misunderstood, and hearing that little voice in my head say, maybe you should stay quiet. That morning, I decided to test myself in the most ordinary place possible, an American grocery store. I walked through the automatic doors with a short shopping list and one strange mission, to speak English instead of hiding behind my phone. The store was busy. A baby was crying near the checkout. Someone was arguing with a shopping cart as if it had personally betrayed them. I smiled and thought, perfect. Nobody here has time to judge my English. Then I needed help finding an item. Normally, I would walk around for 10 minutes pretending I was enjoying the scenery. This time, I stopped an employee and said slowly, excuse me. Could you help me find this? My pronunciation was not perfect. My grammar was not impressive. But the employee smiled and helped me immediately. That tiny moment felt bigger than it should have. I had expected embarrassment. Instead, I got an answer. That taught me something useful about English listening and speaking. Communication does not require perfection. It requires enough clarity, patience, and willingness to try. When I got home, I told my husband about it. He smiled and said, "So, did you survive?" I answered, "Barely." The cereal aisle was dangerous. We laughed, but later that afternoon, I practiced the same sentence again. "Could you help me?" Then I changed it. "Could you say that again?" Then, "I understand." Then, "I have a question." These simple phrases became little tools I could carry everywhere. I began noticing something surprising. The more I practiced familiar sentences, the less I translated every word inside my head. I could listen, pause, and respond more naturally. That made English feel less like a school subject and more like part of my real life. Still, there was one problem. My confidence had grown, but my fear had not completely disappeared. In fact, the next situation was much harder. A few days later, my family was sitting together watching a discussion about the upcoming election. My husband asked what I thought. Normally, I would have said, "I don't know." This time, I opened my mouth and answered. My first sentence was simple. My second sentence surprised even me. And then my daughter suddenly turned off the television and said, "Mom, say that again." My family saw something I didn't. When my daughter turned off the television and asked me to say it again, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. For 1 second, I wanted to laugh, change the subject, and disappear into the kitchen. But she did not look angry. She looked curious. Then she asked, "Mom, why did you suddenly sound so confident?" I had no answer. I had not noticed any confidence. I had only spoken. That was the strange part. For years, I had believed confidence came first and speaking came later. That night, I discovered the opposite might also be true. Sometimes you speak while your hands are shaking, your grammar is imperfect, and your brain is desperately searching for the right word. Then, after you finish, you realize you were brave without feeling brave. My husband smiled and said, "Because she finally stopped trying to sound perfect." I rolled my eyes. "Please don't make this dramatic." He laughed. "You just gave a speech about your opinion, and now you are embarrassed because we noticed." My children laughed too, and suddenly the room felt warm. We talked about the election, but we did not argue about political parties or try to convince each other what to believe. Instead, we talked about something more personal, why people sometimes stay silent even when they have something important to say. I told them that speaking English had taught me a strange lesson. When I was younger, I thought every mistake was evidence that I was not good enough. A wrong word felt enormous. A forgotten phrase felt embarrassing. But now I understood that mistakes were simply information. If I said, "I have agree," instead of "I agree," someone could correct me. Then I could remember it. That is much more useful than staying silent forever. My daughter looked at me and said, "So English helped you speak your mind?" I smiled. Maybe speaking my mind helped me learn English. That sentence surprised all of us. We began laughing because it sounded like one of those complicated quotes people put on coffee mugs. But I meant it. I had stopped studying English as a test I needed to pass. I started using it as a bridge between my thoughts and other people. From that day, my family began encouraging me to speak more. At dinner, my children sometimes asked me random questions just so I could answer in English. My son once asked, "Mom, what is your opinion about pineapple on pizza?" I said, "I have survived many difficult things in America, but that question is too much." Everyone laughed. Those small conversations gave me something textbooks never had, a reason to speak. But one evening, my husband asked a question that made the room completely silent. If your voice matters so much, are you ready to actually use it when it counts? I looked at him, and I knew exactly what he meant. The voting question. I thought I was ready to use my voice. But there is a big difference between saying your opinion at the dinner table and believing that your opinion belongs in a bigger conversation. That night, I stared at my husband and suddenly felt nervous again. What if my English was not good enough? What if I misunderstood something? What if I made a mistake in front of other people? Then my daughter said something that completely changed my thinking. "Mom, you don't need perfect English to have an opinion." I went quiet. That sentence followed me for days. In the United States, voting is one way eligible citizens participate in elections, and the details of registration, voting methods, and deadlines can vary by state. I was not interested in turning our family conversation into a political argument. I was interested in something much more personal, the feeling of being allowed to speak. I started reading simple information about voting in English. At first, some words looked intimidating. Registration, ballot, election, candidate. I wrote each word in my notebook and created simple sentences. I registered to vote. I received my ballot. I have a question. It felt almost funny. I was learning vocabulary while thinking about something deeply emotional. But that was exactly what made the words stick. Instead of memorizing random vocabulary, I connected each word to a real situation. Language researchers often describe this kind of meaningful practice as useful because information connected to context can be easier to remember than isolated words. So I stopped trying to memorize huge lists. I practiced phrases I could actually use. Could you explain this? Where should I go? I need more information. I understand. I don't understand yet. That last sentence became important. I don't understand yet sounded much kinder than I'm bad at English. One evening, I practiced these phrases at the kitchen table while my husband prepared dinner. He looked over and asked, "Are you studying for a test?" I said, "No. I'm studying for real life." He smiled. That sounds dangerous. It is, I said. I might become confident. We laughed. But inside, I felt something changing. I was no longer waiting for someone to give me permission to speak. I was preparing myself to participate. The closer I got to the voting experience, the more emotional it became. I realized this was not simply about choosing something on a ballot. For me, it represented years of staying quiet, doubting myself, and believing that imperfect English meant an imperfect voice. Then the day arrived. I stood outside the voting place, took a deep breath, and repeated my new favorite sentence, I have a voice. I thought the difficult part was over. Then I walked inside, and a worker asked me one simple question I had never practiced. One small act of courage. The question sounded simple, but my heart reacted as if someone had suddenly handed me a microphone in front of 1,000 people. How can I help you today? The worker asked. I understood every word, yet my mind froze. For a second, I wanted to turn around and leave. Then I remembered something my daughter had told me. Mom, you don't need perfect English to have a voice. So I took a breath and said, I have a question. 5 words. That was all. But those 5 words felt like a door opening. The worker smiled and waited. I asked for clarification about the process, listened carefully, and repeated what I understood. When I did not understand one detail, I simply said, could you say that again, please? Nothing terrible happened. Nobody laughed. Nobody judged my accent. The world did not end because my English was not perfect. In fact, the conversation went much more smoothly than I had imagined. That moment taught me a powerful lesson about speaking English. When you do not understand something, asking for repetition is not failure. It is communication. I had spent so much time pretending to understand because I was afraid of looking confused. But pretending creates more confusion. Asking creates clarity. I stepped away from the conversation feeling strangely proud. Not because I had said something impressive, but because I had stayed present when fear told me to escape. Later, I told my husband what happened. He grinned and said, so, you used your famous 5 words. I said, yes. He asked, and did the building collapse? I laughed. No. Very disappointing. That evening, I wrote 3 sentences in my English notebook. I can ask questions. I can make mistakes. I can speak anyway. They became my personal practice. I repeated them slowly, listening to each word, then said them again without looking. This kind of small, repeated practice helped me build confidence because I was training both my language skills and my response to nervousness. I also noticed something unexpected. My fear was not disappearing completely. Instead, I was learning how to move while carrying it. That distinction mattered. Courage was no longer a dramatic feeling. It was simply doing the next small thing. A few days later, my daughter asked me what I had learned from the voting experience. I expected her to ask about the process. Instead, she asked, Mom, what will you do the next time you disagree with someone? I smiled. I'll speak. She nodded. Then she added, even if your English is not perfect? I looked at her and answered, especially then. She smiled, but before we could continue, my son walked into the room holding something that made me completely forget about English for a moment. He said, Mom, I think you need to see this. What my children learned from me. My son was holding a piece of paper, and I could tell from his face that this was not another joke about my English. Mom, I found this in my old school notebook, he said. I looked at the page and saw a sentence written in my handwriting. I want my children to be brave. I stared at it for a long moment. I had written those words years earlier, probably without thinking much about them. But now they felt different. My children had grown up watching me encourage them to speak honestly, ask questions, and stand up for themselves. Yet I had not realized how often I was doing the opposite. I was teaching them to use their voices while quietly hiding mine. My daughter sat beside me and said, "You always tell us that mistakes are okay." I smiled. That sounds like something I would say. She laughed. Then why were you so afraid to make mistakes in English? That question hit harder than I expected. I had no clever answer. I finally said, "Because I forgot that I am allowed to be a learner too." The room became quiet. Then my husband said, "That might be the most honest thing you have said all week." We laughed, but I felt tears in my eyes. That evening became one of the most meaningful family conversations we had ever shared. We talked about school, work, English, opinions, and the strange pressure people sometimes put on themselves to look confident. I explained that learning English had taught me something beyond vocabulary. Listening carefully had taught me patience. Reading simple stories had taught me that understanding comes one sentence at a time. Speaking aloud had taught me that mistakes are not emergencies. And family conversations had taught me that confidence grows faster when people feel safe. I decided to make our English practice even more natural. At dinner, we started choosing one everyday topic and talking about it for a few minutes. No grades. No corrections unless someone asked. Just conversation. Sometimes it was serious. Sometimes it was ridiculous. One night, my son asked, "What would you do if you became president for one day?" I answered, "I would make everyone wash their dishes." He looked horrified. "That is your first law?" I said, "Absolutely. America has suffered enough from dirty plates." Everyone laughed. Those silly conversations were valuable because they made English feel connected to real life. I could make a mistake, laugh, continue, and still be understood. Slowly, my children began asking me for my opinion more often. And then one Sunday morning, something happened that surprised me. My daughter disagreed with me about an important decision. Normally, I might have avoided the conversation. This time, I listened. Then I calmly said, "I understand your point, but I see it differently." She smiled. "Good, Mom. Now you really sound like yourself." I thought that was the end of the lesson. It wasn't. That night, my husband and I had our own disagreement, and this time, neither of us was prepared for what happened next. Love, marriage, and different opinions. I used to think a peaceful marriage meant avoiding difficult conversations. Then one evening, my husband and I discovered the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes silence does not protect love. It simply hides the problem until it becomes too big to ignore. We were sitting at the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the dishes were finally finished, and I thought we were having an ordinary evening. Then my husband asked what I really thought about an important family decision. My first instinct was to say, "Whatever you think is fine." I almost said it. Then I remembered my daughter's words, "Mom, use your voice." So I took a breath and answered honestly, "I don't agree." My husband looked at me. I looked at him. Suddenly, the kitchen felt much smaller. He asked why. I explained my reasons slowly, using simple English because I wanted my meaning to be clear, not impressive. "I understand your point, but I see it differently." That sentence had become more than English practice. It had become a tool for protecting our relationship. We disagreed. Neither of us shouted. Nobody stormed away. We simply listened. And strangely, the disagreement made us feel closer. I realized that communication is not about winning. It is about making enough space for two people to exist honestly in the same conversation. For English learners, this can be an important lesson too. You do not need advanced vocabulary to express disagreement respectfully. Simple phrases can be powerful. "I understand." "I see your point." "I'm not sure." "I feel differently." "Can we talk about it?" I began practicing these phrases in everyday conversations, not because I wanted to sound like a native speaker, but because I wanted to sound like myself. That distinction changed everything. My husband eventually smiled and said, "You know, I actually like hearing what you think." I laughed. "Careful. You might regret saying that." He laughed too. But later, when I was alone in the kitchen, I realized how much had changed. The woman who once avoided speaking English because she feared mistakes was now having a difficult conversation with the person she loved most. I had not suddenly become fearless. I had simply stopped treating fear as a command. A few days later, my husband brought up the voting experience again. He said, "You know what I think your real lesson was?" I asked, "What?" He answered, "You discovered that having a voice does not mean everyone agrees with you." I thought about that all night. He was right. A voice is not valuable because it always wins. It is valuable because it allows you to participate, listen, disagree, learn, and still remain connected to the people you love. Then, just when I thought the hardest part of my journey was behind me, I received a message from my daughter that made my heart stop. She wrote only 7 words, "Mom, I need to tell you something." My voice finally felt real. The message from my daughter was short, but I read it 3 times before calling her. "Mom, I need to tell you something." My mind immediately created 10 terrible stories. That is what anxious brains do best. They can turn 7 innocent words into a full Hollywood disaster. When she answered, I asked, "Are you okay?" She laughed softly. "Yes, Mom. I just wanted to tell you something important." Then she said, "I started practicing English the way you do." I became completely quiet. She explained that she had noticed how I practiced simple sentences every day, even when nobody was listening. She had watched me make mistakes, laugh, repeat the sentence, and try again. She told me that one day, when she felt nervous about speaking during a school discussion, she remembered something I had said. "You don't need perfect words to express a real thought." I felt tears in my eyes. I had spent so much time thinking I was teaching my children how to be confident. I never imagined they were quietly teaching me too. That conversation changed the way I looked at my entire English journey. I realized that progress is not always a dramatic transformation. Sometimes progress looks like asking one question at a grocery store. Sometimes it sounds like saying, "Could you repeat that?" Sometimes it is reading one short paragraph aloud before bed. And sometimes it is sitting across from your husband and saying, "I disagree," without turning the disagreement into a war. These small moments had slowly changed me. My English was still not perfect. I still missed words when people spoke too fast. I still searched for vocabulary sometimes. I still made grammar mistakes. But something important had disappeared, the shame. I no longer believed every mistake was proof that I was failing. A mistake simply showed me what I could practice next. That mindset made listening easier too. Instead of panicking when I missed one sentence, I stayed with the conversation and listened for the next idea. Instead of translating every word, I focused on the meaning. For anyone learning English, this can be a powerful habit. Do not punish yourself for missing a word. Keep listening. Keep the story moving. Your brain needs context, repetition, and patience. That evening, I sat on the porch with my husband. The American neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car passed slowly. The sky was turning dark, and for once, I did not feel like I was waiting for the next version of myself. I felt present. My husband looked at me and said, "You seem peaceful." I smiled. Maybe I finally stopped trying to become someone else. He reached for my hand. "And who are you now?" I looked toward our house, where my children were laughing inside. Then I answered, "I'm someone who knows her voice matters." I thought that was the end of the story. But the following morning, something arrived at our front door that made me realize my journey had one final lesson left. A voice worth sharing. The package at our front door was small, ordinary, and completely unexpected. My name was written across the label, and for a moment I simply stared at it. I opened the box and found a simple notebook from my daughter with one sentence written on the first page, "Mom, keep telling your story." I smiled, then cried. I realized that my journey had never really been about voting, politics, or perfect English. It had been about learning to participate in my own life. Living in America had taught me that people can disagree and still sit at the same dinner table. My marriage had taught me that honest communication can make love stronger. My children had taught me that confidence is often something we give to others before we learn to give it to ourselves. And English had taught me patience. I still practice every day. Sometimes I read a short story aloud. Sometimes I listen to slow English while making coffee. Sometimes I repeat one sentence until it feels natural. I do not chase perfection anymore. I chase connection. When I hear a word I do not understand, I keep listening. When I make a grammar mistake, I correct it and continue. When I need more time, I simply say, "Could you say that again?" Those small sentences changed my life because they gave me permission to stay in the conversation. If you are learning English right now, I want you to remember something simple. You do not have to sound perfect to sound like yourself. Your accent does not erase your intelligence. A mistake does not erase your progress. A slow sentence is still a sentence. A quiet voice is still a voice. And sometimes, the person who thinks they have nothing important to say is exactly the person whose story someone else needs to hear. That evening, my family sat together for dinner. My daughter raised her glass of water and said, to Mom's voice. My son added, and to her terrible jokes. I laughed. Excuse me. My jokes are excellent. My husband shook his head. That is exactly the problem. We all laughed until the room felt warm again. I looked around the table and realized how far I had come without noticing. I had started with fear. I had practiced with tiny sentences. I had learned to listen without panic, speak without shame, disagree without anger, and love without silence. My voice had not become louder. It had simply become mine. So if you are listening to this story while practicing English, repeat one sentence with me, my voice matters. Say it slowly. Say it again. You do not need perfect English. You only need the courage to begin. Because sometimes, the smallest sentence can open the biggest door. And sometimes, finding your voice is not about speaking louder, it is about finally believing that what you have to say is worth hearing.